Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 10 of how to make a Metroidvania, where we'll be teaching you how you can create a Metroidvania like Hollow Knight in Unity. In this episode, we'll finally be delving into the boss, rounding out the Metroidvania experience with an epic battle. The boss that we'll be recreating is the Hollow Knight. We already have the sprites for the knight, meaning we don't need to import any new assets. Also, I'm lazy.
Bruh.
We'll drag out an empty game object and name it THK Handler, THK being the Hollow Knight. Under this, we'll add the knight sprite. Now, we're doing this instead of putting sprites in the parent, as our animations will include rotation and position manipulation of the sprites, and we don't want that to affect the knight's actual position and rotation. We'll make the knight sprite a little darker to differentiate it from the player. Then, add a light to it so that we can see it clearly. We'll then add a box collider, a rigid body, and audio source. And make the knight much bigger also. Don't forget to tag it as an enemy and layer to attackable. The Hollow Knight has multiple animations. Along with the idle and run, we also have the slash, lunge, parry, dive, barrage, outbreak, bounce, and stunned, among other things. So we'll create the animations. We can't use the player's animator controller, as there will be new animations and parameters for the boss. Firstly, we'll create an intro animation. Then, we'll create the basic animations. Okay, now we'll create the slash, parry, and stunned. Now, we'll move on to the dive animation. The dive will only occur after the knight jumps up, so we'll start with the jump sprite and transition to the lunge sprite. We'll also rotate it so that it faces down. Next up, we'll be doing the bounce animation. We'll create a bend down animation because the bounce starts with the knight bending down. We'll also be using this bend down animation for the barrage attack as well. Afterwards, we'll create the bounce part 1 animation, where we'll rotate the knight to face upwards. And finally, the part 2 animation. The part 1 animation plays when the knight is bouncing upwards, which is why it bends backwards. And the part 2 animation plays when the knight is falling, so it bends forwards. Physics. Finally, we can create the death animation. This one will also have 3 parts. The first part to set up the animation. The second to glow a bit. And finally, collapsing into the ball and disappearing like the player's death. We'll uncheck loop time for all the animations except the idle, run, stunned, and death too. We'll then link up the animations in the animator window. The intro will be the default entry. Then, we'll transition to idle. From the idle, we'll transition to run if the run bool is true.
I keep having this nagging feeling that I've forgotten something.
Hey, if you forgot it, it probably wasn't all that important.
Yeah, I guess.
As for the rest, we'll make them transition from any state. The cast and dive animations will transition from jump. We'll also link the cast from bend down. We'll then create some parameters. Triggers, slash, bend down, bounce 1, bounce 2, grounded, and die. And bools, stunned, lunge, jump, cast, dive, and parry. We'll then add them to the arrows. Not all the arrows will have parameters, so here are the arrows that do, and their respective settings as well. Alright, with the animation set up, let's create a script, the Hollow Knight, in the THK handler. We'll make it inherit from the enemy base class. We'll create a few variables. We'll be taking quite a number of them from the player controller, like the slash effect, attack areas, and ground check. We'll then create floats, attack range, and attack timer, int, hit counter, bools, stunned, can stun, and alive, and finally a float, run speed. In the enemy base class, we'll create 4 enums, one for each stage of the boss fight. In start, we'll call the base start and assign the variables again, as some of the components of the knight are in the children. We'll also create a bool, grounded, which will be identical to the player's one. We'll also do an on-draw gizmos for the attack areas. We'll override the change enemy state function for now, but only add the cases. Next, override the on-collision state and remove the attack function from it. Afterwards, create a flip function. Unlike the shade, we can't simply flip the sprite as we aren't using the collider to attack the player. So we'll need to flip it like we flip the player. We'll create a bool facing right and set it accordingly as well. Now we'll need some variables for attacking. A bool, attacking, and float, attack countdown. Our first attack will be the triple slash. Create a coroutine triple slash. Here, we'll set attacking to true. Then, set the velocity to 0. Next, we'll trigger the slash animation 3 times. The wait for seconds here are mimicking the slash rate of the Hollow Knight. Now, we'll create a function, attack handler. Firstly, if the current state is stage 1, if the player is within the attack range, we'll call the triple slash, else return. We'll just stick to stage 1 for now. Don't worry, we'll expand on this later. In the inspector, we'll create transforms, attack transform, up attack transform, and down attack transform, and ground check. Like the player, the ground check is placed at the feet of the knight, while the attack transforms are placed at the right side, above, and below respectively. We'll then set the attack areas and reposition the attack transforms respectively. To control the attacking and all that, we'll be using state machines. We could use a finite state machine, but Unity actually provides a state machine that's been pre-coded already, the animator. We can go in and out of the states at the call of a parameter. We'll create a script on the idle state. Here, we'll only need the enter, update, and exit functions. We'll create a variable rigid body, then assign them in enter. We'll be doing this for all the other scripts created on animation states as well. Next, we'll create a function, run2player. Here, we'll call the run bool if the player is further than the attack range. In update, we'll set the velocity to 0, since this is the idle state, and then call the run2player. We'll also call the attack handler function if the attack countdown reaches 0. Then we'll reset it to the attack timer. We'll also create a script on the run animation and create a function, target player position. Here, we'll make the knight move towards the player. If they're close enough, set the run to false. We'll call it in update and call the attack handler if the attack countdown reaches 0. On exit, we'll set run to false as well. Now, in the Hollow Knight script, we'll make the attack countdown reduce in update. We'll also create a function, reset all attacks. This will be called if we want to stop whatever the knight is doing. Here, we'll set attacking to false and stop the triple slash coroutine. We'll call this at the end of triple slash coroutine. Let's assign the variables and test it out. The knight runs towards the player and attacks when in range. Splendid. Alright, let's make this nicer a bit, shall we? Let's add the slash effect and actually deal damage to the player. The slash effect can be copied from the player controller, but we'll create a function, slash angle, to handle where the slash spawns. We'll call this after we trigger the slash animation. we'll be using animation events for the damage dealing. So let's create a script, THK events, under the Hollow Knight. This script must be on the game object that has the animator attached, otherwise it won't work. We'll create a function, hit, with arguments transform, attack transform, and vector2, attack area. We'll check if there's a player in the attack area and deal damage to the player if so. We'll then create another function, /damagePlayer. Here, we'll define which attack transform and attack area we want to use. If the player is in front, we want to use the side attack transform, and etc. Now, in the slash animation, we'll add the /damagePlayer event the moment the sword slashes down. And if we test it out now, we get a slash effect and the knight deals damage. In stage 1, the knight also has another attack, the Lunge. So let's create that. In the Hollow Knight script, we'll create a coroutine, Lunge. We'll flip the knight before setting the Lunge animation to true. After 1 second, we'll set it to false and reset the attacks. Now create a script on the Lunge state. In update, we'll set the gravity to 0 and make the knight dash in its respective direction. If the player is hit, we'll deal damage. Now to avoid the infinite damage bug, we'll create a bool, damaged player, in the Hollow Knight script and set it to false by default. We'll then set it to true after we deal damage to the player. After the Lunge animation stops playing, we'll reset it back to false. In reset all attacks, we'll stop the Lunge. Now we'll call the Lunge if the attack handler is called and the knight is not close enough to do the slash. The Hollow Knight also has another move, the Parry. We'll create a bool, parrying. Then, we'll create a coroutine, Parry. Here, we'll set attacking to true, set the velocity to 0, and play the parry animation. The parry will last 0.75 seconds, so to account for the transition, we'll set the wait for seconds to 0.8f before setting the parry to false. Finally, reset it. In reset, we'll stop the parry as well. Now, you notice that parrying isn't actually set to true here. This is because we'll set it in the THK event script. So when the animation reaches its appropriate stage, it'll automatically be set to true. In the enemy gets hit function, the knight will only take damage if it's not parrying, and then it'll parry. If it is already parrying, it'll stop parrying, and then attack the player with a riposte. Let's create the riposte. We'll be using the slash, but instead of 3, it'll only be 1. If we test it out, the knight will parry if they take damage. Now, when the knight reaches stage 4, it won't parry anymore, so we'll implement that as well. And with that done, we can move on to the stage 2 attacks. The first one we'll be creating is the Diving Flame Pillar attack. We'll create some variables, a vector2, move to position, bool, dive attack, and game objects, diving collider, and pillar. In reset, we'll set dive attack to false. Then, we'll create 2 functions, dive attack jump, and dive. In dive attack jump, we'll set the move to position to the player's current position plus 10 in the y-axis, as we want the knight to jump above the player. We'll set dive attack to true before playing the jump animation. We'll then create an on-trigger enter just like the player's desolate dive, but we'll make the player recoil as well. Now in dive, we'll set dive to true and jump to false. We'll create a script for the jump and dive states. In boss jump, we'll create a function, dive attack. Here, check if the dive attack bool is true. If it is, flip and move the knight to the move to position specified in the dive attack jump. Once reached, we'll call the dive function. In boss dive, we'll set the diving collider to true. Once the knight is grounded, we'll set it to false. We'll then stop playing the dive animation and reset the attacks. The dive also has another part, the flame pillars. So in the Hollow Knight script, we'll create a function, diving pillars. We'll find the knight's impact point, which will be its ground track position the moment this is called. Then we'll create a float, spawn distance, which will be how far apart the pillars will spawn. Let's say 5. Now, we'll make the pillars spawn on both sides of the impact point before resetting the attacks. Let's have 10 pillars on each side. We'll adjust the values accordingly if need be. Now in boss dive, we'll call diving pillars. But because it's an update, that could cause multiple calls to the function. So we'll create a bool, call once, and ensure that it only happens once. On exit, we'll reset call once. Now, we'll create a game object, diving collider under the knight, with a trigger collider. Don't forget to set it to false by default. Next up, we'll create the pillars. We'll use the fireball sprite for this. We'll add a glow as well. Now in the sprite editor, we'll change its pivot point to the front. This will alter the fireball spell as well, so we'll have to fix that. Now, we'll create an animation for the pillar. We'll be making it rise up before falling back down by adjusting its scale. This looks good. Create a script, diving pillar. Here, we'll simply deal damage to the player if they contact the pillar. Finally, add a trigger collider and the destroy after animation script. Ensure that the collider changes with the animation as well before making it a prefab. Now, we'll swap out the lunge for the dive in the attack handler function and assign all the necessary variables. And then we'll test it out. Looks good. The next stage 2 attack we'll be making is the Barrage attack. We'll create variables, bool, barrage attack, and game object, barrage fireball. Then we'll set barrage attack to false and reset all attacks. Next, we'll create a function, barrage bend down, and a coroutine, barrage. In barrage bend down, we'll set the velocity to 0, and set barrage attack and the bend down trigger to true. In Barrage, we'll also ensure that the velocity is 0, and then we'll instantiate 10 projectiles. we'll create a float current angle, defaulted to 30. Make sure that the barrage only launches projectiles in the direction the knight is facing. After each projectile, we'll add 5 to the current angle. Then we'll delay the next projectile by 0.4 seconds. After all the projectiles have been launched, we'll set the cast animation to false and reset the attacks. Once again, we'll be triggering this via animation events. So in THK events, we'll create a function, bend down check, and coroutine barrage attack transition. In the former, we'll start the barrage attack transition if barrage attack is true. And in the latter, we'll set cast to true after a second. As the cast animation will be used for both the barrage and the outbreak attack, we'll create a function, barrage or outbreak, and start the barrage if barrage attack is true. Now in the editor, we'll place the bend down check at the end of the bend down animation and the barrage or outbreak at the start of the cast animation. So now we'll need something for the barrage to shoot out. Let's drag in the fireball prefab and rename it Barrage Fireball. Remove the fireball script and add a script, Barrage Fireball, to it. We'll create some variables. Vector 2, start force min max. Float, turn speed, defaulted to 0.5, and a reference to the rigid body. In start, we'll add an impulse force to the fireball at a random force between the vector 2 values. Then in update, we'll make sure that the velocity is not 0 before setting it to move forwards. Then we'll set it to rotate the nose of the fireball to always face the direction it's moving. Physics! Then we'll create an on-trigger enter and damage the player if it hits them. Back in the editor, we'll set the start force min-max to 30 and 50 respectively. Then add a rigid body to the fireball and let's increase its gravity scale to 5 so it falls faster. We'll adjust its scale so that it looks good. Now make it a prefab and assign the variables to the Hollow Knight, and then we can test it out. Awesome! With the barrage completed, we can finally move on to the attacks of Stage 3. We'll start with the Outbreak attack. Let's create a bool, Outbreak attack, and set it to false and reset all attacks. Next, we'll create a function, Outbreak bend down, and a coroutine, Outbreak. In Outbreak bend down, we'll set the velocity to 0, and set the move to position to 5 units above its current position. Then, we'll set Outbreak attack to true, and play the bend down animation. In Outbreak, we'll wait for a moment before playing the cast animation. Then, we'll be launching 30 fireballs in 3 directions, diagonally left and right and towards the bottom of the knight. Then, we'll force the knight down and set cast to false after a moment. Finally, we'll reset the attacks. Now we'll need to create a script in the bend down state. We'll create a function, Outbreak attack, and check if Outbreak attack is true. If so, we'll move the knight to the specified move to position, and to ensure that the knight won't fall from the position, we'll freeze its RB position. On exit, we'll reset the bend down trigger. Back in the Outbreak coroutine, we'll have to undo the RB constraints done previously. And we must also freeze the rotation separately, as none literally means none. In THK events, we'll add a coroutine, Outbreak Attack Transition, which will set cast to true after a second. We'll call this in the bend down check, similar to the Barrage Attack Transition. Now in Barrage or Outbreak, we'll call the Outbreak if Outbreak Attack is true. Now let's test it out.
Nice.
And now, we'll be making the final attack of the Hollow Knight, the Bouncing Balloon Attack. We'll be creating a bool, bounce attack, and a float, rotation direction to target. Set bounce attack to false and reset all attacks. Now, we'll create a function, calculate target angle. Here, we'll calculate the bearing of the player relative to the knight. Then we'll set the rotation direction to target to the calculated value. Next, we'll create two more functions, bounce attack and bounce bend down. In bounce attack, we'll simply set attacking to true and call bounce bend down for now. It will be expanded upon later. In bounce bend down, we'll set the velocity to 0 and set move to position to 10 above the player. Then, we'll set the bounce attack to true and play the bend down animation. We'll need to create scripts for both the bounce 1 and bounce 2 states. In boss bounce 1, we'll check if bounce attack is true first, before moving the knight to the move to position. Once reached, we'll call calculate target angle and play the bounce 2 animation. On exit, we'll reset the bounce 1 trigger. Now in boss bounce 2, we'll force the knight down at the rotation direction to target and set the diving collider to true. Once grounded, we'll disable the diving collider, reset the attack, and trigger grounded. To avoid bugs, we'll create a bool, call once, and make sure that the reset is only called once. On exit, we'll reset bounce 2 and call once. Now before we can test it out, we'll need to trigger the bounce 1 animation in bend down check. Alright, let's see. Sweet. Alright. We aren't done yet. That can be from 2 to up to 5 bounces during the attack. So let's implement that before you start celebrating. In the Hollow Knight script, we'll add an int bounce count and set it to a random number from 2 to 5 in bounce attack. Then, we'll create an int bounces, defaulted to 0. Next, we'll create a function check bounce. If bounces is less than bounce count minus 1, we'll add to bounces and call bounce bend down. Else, reset bounces and force play the run animation. We'll call check bounce in boss bounce 2 after reset all attacks. Now, let's test this out. Great! With all the attacks done, we'll move on to the stun mechanics. In update enemy states, we'll set can stun to true in stages 1 and 2, and false in 3 and 4. In update, we'll stop the knight from moving if it's stunned. Now, we'll create a coroutine, stunned, and set stunned to true, and set hit counter to 0. Then, we'll play the stunned animation for 6 seconds. Finally, we'll set stunned to false. Now when enemy gets hit, we'll only run the current code if it's not stunned, else stop being stunned. So if the player attacks the stunned knight, it will no longer be stunned. If the knight is not parrying, we'll check if it can be stunned. If so, we'll add it to the hit counter. And if it is above, let's say 3 for testing purposes, it's actually supposed to be 13, then we'll reset the attacks and stun the knight. To test out the can stun, we'll set the states in enemy gets hit. For now, let's have a max health of 25. Now let's see. If we hit the knight enough times, it'll be stunned. Perfect. Okay, time to kill the knight. The override death will remove everything and reset the attacks. Afterwards, we'll set alive to false and make it drop to the ground. Finally, trigger the death animation. We'll also create another function, destroy after death, where we'll just destroy the game object. Now in THK events, we'll create a function, destroy after death, and call the destroy after death function. Okay, we'll be calling the destroy after death on the last frame of the death tree animation. In enemy gets hit, we'll call the death if the health reaches 0. We can also do the same in update as well, as a safeguard. Now if we test it out, the knight dies and plays a very nice animation before destroying itself. Alright, now let's finish up the AI for the knight. Most of it has actually been done already through the state machine, so we don't need to do much. Firstly, we'll set the attack timer in the stages. Let's say stage 1 has a timer of 6. In stage 2, the attack should occur more often, so let's set it as 5. In stage 3, it should slow down, so let's set it to 8. And finally, in stage 4, we'll set it to 10. We'll also set the run speed to the speed in stage 1, and to half that in stage 4 since it should slow down in stage 4. In boss idle and boss run, we'll set the attack countdown to vary between attack timer -1 and +1 to make it less predictable. Now in the attack handler, there are only 2 attacks in stage 1, the triple slash and lunge. In stage 2, the barrage and dive are added. I'll make it randomly select one of them. In stage 3, the triple slash is no longer used, so we can remove the distance check. The lunge is no longer done, but is instead replaced by the outbreak and bounce. Stage 4 is similar to stage 1, but the slash replaces the triple slash and bounce replaces the lunge. Now if we test it out, we should have a boss fight with 4 stages with different attacks in each stage. Perfect. With the boss basically done, let's add some effects to make it look nice. Firstly, we'll be making a version of the orange blood for the boss that's not as slow. Next, we'll make a particle effect for when they impact the ground. Okay, let's instantiate the impact particle in boss dive and boss bounce too. When the knight reaches stage 3, let's also begin instantiating the blood to depict a sense of damage accumulation. In the Hollow Knight script, we'll create 2 floats, blood countdown and blood timer. Then in update, we'll decrease the blood countdown, and if it reaches 0, we'll instantiate the blood and reset the blood countdown. We'll set the blood timer to 5 in stage 3, 1.5 in stage 4, and 0.8 in the death. Now let's assign the variables and test it out. Looks good. With that done, we'll now spawn in the boss in the appropriate area. So when we cross this wall and the camera shifts, the boss battle will begin. Make sure the wall has a trigger collider, and then we'll create a script, spawn boss, on it. We'll make it a static script so we can access it elsewhere. We'll create a transform, spawn point, game object, boss, vector2, exit direction, bool, call once, and a reference to the box collider attached. Next up, create a coroutine, walk into room. We'll then call the walk into new scene coroutine from the player controller. This forces them to walk in the exit direction specified, preventing bugs that can occur if the player decides to back out of facing the boss.
Международного гроссмейстера, заслуженного мастера спорта СССР Анатолия Карпова.
Afterwards, we'll wait for a second before setting the is trigger on the collider to false, sealing the exit, and then we'll spawn the boss. Now let's make an on trigger enter, and if the player enters, we'll call walk into new scene. But make sure it only occurs once. And finally, after the boss is slayed, we want to set the is trigger back to true so the player can exit the arena. So we'll create a function is not trigger for that. We'll call this in THK events before we destroy the boss game object. In the inspector, we'll create a game object, boss spawn point, and place it where we want the boss to spawn. Then we'll assign the values. Now let's test it out. We can't exit the room after going in. And we can only exit after we slay the boss. Excellent. Alright, now let's shift all the scripts we made into the scripts folder. And with that, we have finally reached our minimum viable product mechanics. Over these past 10 episodes, we have created a Hollow Knight clone in Unity, from the basic movement mechanics to spells and even a final boss. As this episode draws to a close, it is with a heavy heart that we regret to inform you, our dear viewers, that we'll no longer be actively developing the Metroidvania anymore. We hope that everything you've learned throughout the series will prove invaluable in your game development journey. Once again, I'm Matias.
And I'm Kiefer.
Thank you for sticking with us throughout the series, and we hope to see you again. Thank you for watching till the end, and we hope you've enjoyed the video. Want to support what we do? You can help us by becoming a Patreon. This will give you access to the project files for tutorials, as well as Patreon exclusive posts on our blog. Any support you can give will be invaluable to us, as currently we're only making back about 20 cents for every dollar we put into content creation. So your patronage will go a long way to help us make this a sustainable endeavor. See you in the next video.